The hum of the engines was the only lullaby she needed. Seat 7C had become her temporary cocoon, and Emily Bennett, a woman who usually slept lightly even in the comfort of her own home, was dozing like a child. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight. New York to Denver, 3 hours in the sky, then a drive into the mountains where her younger brother lived. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year, and the reunion was meant to be a balm after months of exhaustion, grief, and quiet loneliness. She shifted slightly against the headrest, her auburn hair falling forward, and for the first time in weeks she felt at peace. The chaos of airports, the chatter of passengers, even the crying baby in the row behind her, none of it reached her now. But then came the voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his tone steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "This is your captain speaking. I apologize for disturbing your flight, but we have a serious situation. If there is anyone on board with flight experience, anyone who knows how to operate an aircraft, please ring your call button immediately. We need your help." The cabin went still. Emily's eyes snapped open. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had dreamt it. But no, the murmur of alarm rising among the passengers told her this was very, very real. She sat upright, her pulse racing. The words echoed in her head. "Can anyone fly this plane?" Emily wasn't a pilot, not officially, but flying was in her blood. Her father had been an Air Force pilot, her childhood filled with stories of clouds, cockpits, and impossible landings. And she, once upon a time, had been on her way to following in his footsteps. She had logged hundreds of hours in a flight simulator during college, even taken private lessons in a Cessna. She could still remember the thrill of her first solo takeoff, the way the runway blurred beneath her wheels as the earth fell away. But life had other plans. Her mother's sudden illness forced her to step away from aviation school. She became a nurse instead, putting others' lives above her dreams. Years passed, and while she never regretted caring for her mother until the end, her flight training became a distant memory, half buried but never erased. And now, here she was. The flight attendant's face was pale as she hurried down the aisle, repeating the captain's call. "If anyone here has flown before, military, commercial, even small aircraft, please, let us know." Passengers looked at one another in panic. A businessman in 4A shook his head. A young man scrolling on his phone muttered, "This can't be real." Emily's heart thudded in her chest. She wasn't sure she could do it. She wasn't sure anyone could. But something inside her stirred, a voice that sounded like her father's. "Don't you dare sit back when lives are on the line." Her hand rose before her brain caught up. I have some flight experience," she said, her voice trembling at first, then steadier. "Not commercial jets, but small planes. I've trained." Every head in the rows around her turned. Relief and doubt mixed on their faces, as though they couldn't decide whether she was their miracle or their doom. The flight attendant seized her hand like a lifeline. "Come with me." The narrow aisle felt endless as Emily followed the attendant to the locked cockpit door. Her palms were clammy, her legs shaking. This wasn't a simulator. This wasn't a Cessna. This was a Boeing 737, heavy and complex, carrying more than 160 souls. The door opened, and the sight inside made her blood run cold. The captain slumped against his seat, unconscious, his face pale. The first officer was trying desperately to revive him, his head set askew, his eyes wild with fear. "He's had a heart attack," the officer gasped. "I can't keep flying and save him at the same time. Please, tell me you can help." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. She stepped into the cockpit, the glowing panels and endless switches both familiar and alien. She had studied layouts like this before, but never with this much at stake. "I'll try," she whispered. The first officer slid back into his seat, sweat streaking his brow. "We're at 32,000 feet. Autopilot is engaged, but I can't land this thing alone. Do you understand?" "Yes," Emily said, more confidently than she felt. Her hands brushed the yoke, the cool metal vibrating with the hum of the engines. It felt heavier than the controls she remembered, yet strangely alive, like a living creature under her touch. "Okay," the officer said quickly, "you're going to help me with checklists. I'll handle communications. You're my co-pilot now." The words sent a jolt through her. Co-pilot. She had dreamed of this once, but never like this. The radio crackled. Air traffic control's calm voice filled the cockpit. Flight 228, we understand your captain is incapacitated. Confirm. Do you have another qualified pilot on board? The officer hesitated. Emily leaned forward, pressing the transmit button with a steadying breath. This is Emily Bennett, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. I have private flight training. I can assist. There was a pause on the other end, then a voice that carried both gravity and encouragement. Understood, Emily. We'll guide you through. You're not alone. As the minutes passed, her old training began to stir like embers rekindled into flame. Muscle memory guided her hands. The altimeter, the throttle, the navigation displays, they weren't strangers after all. Her father's words returned in fragments. Trust the instruments, not your fear. Airplanes want to fly. Your job is to guide them home. She remembered afternoons in a sunlit hangar, her father standing beside her, his hand resting proudly on her shoulder. She remembered the way her mother had smiled the first time she returned from the air, cheeks flushed with exhilaration. And she remembered the silence of the hospital room when her mother slipped away, the silence that had grounded her dreams. Now, sitting in 7C seemed like another life. Back in the cabin, passengers whispered prayers. Some clutched hands, others pressed rosaries or photos to their chests. The story had already spread. The captain was down, and a passenger, a woman from 7C, was in the cockpit. A little girl in row 12 asked her mother in a hushed voice, "Is the lady going to save us?" The mother, fighting tears, whispered back, "I hope so, sweetheart. I hope so." Inside the cockpit, Emily felt the weight of those 160 hearts pressing on her shoulders. Every decision mattered. Every adjustment meant life or death. The first officer guided her through step after step, adjusting headings, monitoring fuel, communicating with air traffic control. Denver loomed ahead, a runway waiting like a lifeline. But turbulence struck, sudden and violent. The plane jolted, and alarms screamed across the panels. Passengers gasped in terror. Emily gripped the controls, her knuckles white. For a terrifying moment, she felt the nose dip, the wings shudder. Panic clawed at her chest. But then, her father's voice again, steady in her mind, "Trust the instruments. Airplanes want to fly." She steadied the yoke, adjusted trim, leveled the wings. The alarms ceased. The plane steadied. The first officer looked at her with awe. "You just saved us from a stall," he said quietly. Emily barely breathed. She hadn't saved them yet. The hardest part was still ahead, the landing. The city lights of Denver twinkled faintly ahead, a patchwork of gold against the darkening horizon. For Emily, they looked both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. "All right," the first officer said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "We're beginning descent. This is where it gets tricky." Emily nodded, though her throat was dry. The autopilot had been holding steady, but now came the moment of truth, taking manual control and bringing 180,000 pounds of metal safely back to Earth. "Checklist," she said, forcing her voice steady, just like her father had taught her. "Flaps, set, landing gear, armed, wheel extend soon." Her hands trembled slightly on the yoke. She took a deep breath, remembering the little Cessna she had once landed in a gusting crosswind. This wasn't the same, not even close, but maybe courage felt the same no matter the size of the wings. Back in the cabin, passengers held their breath. Some wept openly. A man in 21A clutched a wedding ring, whispering apologies to the wife he feared he'd never see again. And in row 12, the little girl who had asked about the lady in the cockpit was now drawing with crayons on the back of an airsickness bag. She sketched a plane with angel wings, soaring toward the sun. "She's going to do it, Mommy," the girl said softly, as though it were already decided. "The final approach, Emily," the first officer said, "I'll handle radio. You fly." The tower's voice came through the headset. "Flight 228, you are cleared for approach on runway 17 left. Winds calm. Emergency crews standing by." Emily's pulse thundered. She lowered the nose slightly, adjusting power. The runway stretched ahead, a thin ribbon of light in the vast dark. "Too high," the officer warned. She corrected gently, speed dropping. She eased the throttle forward. Every second was a battle against doubt, against panic. She whispered under her breath, "Come on, Dad. Guide me." The plane roared lower, slicing through the night. The runway lights grew larger, brighter, beckoning. At 500 feet, alarms chirped. Too fast, the officer barked. Emily fought the urge to yank the yoke. She steadied her hands. Trust the instruments. Trust the plane. 200 feet. The runway was clear in sight now, lines glowing white against the black. Gear down, the officer said. With a clunk, the landing gear extended. The whole plane rattled. Passengers gasped again, clutching their armrests. 100 feet, Emily whispered, please, please. 50 feet, she pulled back gently, flaring the nose. The wheels kissed the runway. Hard. Too hard. The plane bounced once, twice. Her heart nearly stopped. Steady, the officer shouted. Emily held on, corrected, flared again. With a bone-jarring thud, the wheels caught. Rubber screamed against asphalt. Brakes roared. Reverse thrust thundered like a hurricane. The plane slowed more, and finally, stopped. Silence. For one long, suspended moment, silence. Then the cabin erupted into cheers, sobs, applause, unrestrained relief. Emily sat frozen, hands still gripping the controls, breath coming in ragged gasps. The first officer was staring at her, disbelief mingled with gratitude. You did it, he whispered. You just landed a 737. She blinked, hardly believing it herself. Her knees trembled, tears stung her eyes. When the paramedics rushed in to take the captain, passengers streamed past, some touching her arm, some murmuring thanks, some simply looking at her like she was a miracle. The little girl from row 12 ran up before her mother could stop her. She held out the crayon drawing of the plane with angel wings. This is you, she said, smiling shyly. Emily's tears spilled over as she knelt to accept it. Hours later, when the chaos had calmed and the passengers had gone on to their lives, Emily sat alone in the terminal, staring out at the dark runway. She thought of her father, how proud he would have been. She thought of her mother, who had once told her, your dreams may sleep, but they never die. She had saved 160 lives tonight. But more than that, she had saved a part of herself she thought was lost forever. As the sun's first light broke over the mountains, Emily stood, shoulders straighter, heart lighter. She was no longer just a woman in 7C. She was a pilot.